I was asked about naming my appointment, and I gave it some thought, and I talked to some people on the faculty, and after very little deliberation, I realized that one of the themes that I wanted to send to the law school, one of the messages that I wanted to send through my appointment, is that we would continue to build upon the legacy of Professor Al Slocum and his long-term commitment to this institution, to public institution, to inclusiveness, to social justice, to opportunity. And there's certainly, it's certainly important for me as the dean here to recognize the tremendous work that many people in this room have done before me in terms of opening up the pathways, not only for me as the dean, but for our faculty members, and most importantly, our many students who are here today. Rutgers Law School, Newark, the People's Electric Law School, lives.
But Al was such a remarkable person. Those of you who know him know this. He had this wonderful sense of humor. If you knew him, you had to like him. He would do what was right, and he'd do it with vigor, and he'd do it with integrity, and he'd do it as hard as he could. But he did it fairly, he did it right, and nobody could ever really get mad at him. And he had respect all over the place. I mean, I was a Republican governor with a Democratic legislature, and so we occasionally had a few problems with confirmations and so on. Never big ones, but some. I remember I nominated Al Slocum, and he went to the Senate for confirmation. And about half an hour later, he was back. And I said, Al, did I put it off? He said, no, it's over. And one of the senators told me afterwards, the Democratic senator said to me, you know, we confirmed him right away. And I said, well, that's very nice. I wish you'd do all of them that way. And I said, why? And he said, well, you know, I don't know the man. But, you know, I know I was reasonably close to the African-American community in those days. I was Man of the year before for the NAACP. As a Republican, I'd gotten 60% of the African-American vote. I carried Newark and Camden and Jersey. So I was fairly close to the African-American community. And the senator said to me, you know, we know you've got a lot of friends in that area. And this guy comes in, and he's got a bald head, and he's got a little goatee, and he looked at me like this, and I thought, we're going to confirm him right away. But he was such a wonderful influence. By the way, you know, when I left office, a future governor abolished the position. People didn't like it, and when they could, they abolished it. But Al did it well. We had some good public advocates. Al was probably the best in many, many ways, because he had this passion for justice and a passion for helping those who needed help the most, of seeking those people out and doing what he could. And I remember I shared a story with him once that I liked in that area of going back to the time just after the Civil War. And Julia Ward Howe was a wonderful woman at the time, abolitionist and all of that, approached Senator Sumner. And she was for an individual who needed help. And Senator Sumner looked at her and said, Julia, I don't think I have time anymore for individuals. And Julia looked at him and said, Senator, even God hasn't gotten that far. He had time for individuals. He had time for people. He cared terribly about people, about everybody, all the time. He brought people together. He believed, I think, that power and justice somehow had to go together. That if somebody was powerful, they had to be just. If somebody was just, they should be powerful. And that somehow the two things had to come together. That was a fundamental belief of Al's. He was such a pleasure to be with. He used to come on cabinet retreats, and he was always one of the most popular people there. I mean, everybody else in my cabinet liked him. And we need him. Right now we need him. I mean, we really need him. Because, men and women are monuments in some cases when they stand out like Al did, when they believe in justice, they believe in the right things, and sort of people live by the burning souls that they have and understand from them what human beings can be and ought to be. And we need people like that to stand up as examples today. And we don't have enough of them. But we remember Al. We remember Al, and we'll be better for remembering him in every way. There's a playwright I always loved called J. Barrie. And he said, God gave us memory that we might have roses in December. I feel better when I think about Al. And I think you do too. You do too. Thank you for having me.
So, to summarize, Al Slocum, to me, is the personification of this law school. He was highly intelligent, an analytical thinker, a very skilled teacher. He was dedicated to excellence, and he was dedicated to making the world a better place. Al Slocum, to me, is in the pantheon of engaged scholars who have served on the faculty of this school. The Arthur Canoys, Alan Axelrod, Frank Askin, Anna Mae Shepard, Willard Heckel, Paul Trachtenberg. Al Slocum is right there with them. And this school, to me, is Al Slocum's legacy. And we owe it to him to do him proud as we carry this school forward. Thank you.
But beyond these perspectives, Al would be, if he were here, I think, a stalwart advocate of what the call that we have as a university and that our Chancellor, Nancy Cantor, has titled Protective Justice and Opportunity Building. To many of us, Al, as Oliver has said, is a forerunner of the vision we now have as an anchor institution, that we are the leaders that we have been looking for, and it is our responsibility to lay the groundwork for inequality to be supplanted by a new paradigm, even a new language of inclusion and equitable development. Because after all, it was the People's Electric Law School, through its clinics, who performed feats of legal mastery that altered the lives of oppressed people, who actually began to engage in what is now called publicly engaged scholarship. And there was no program that embodied the principle of building bridges to equity and democracy better than the MSP, which Al, even as a student, had a playbook of strategies for its creation, its implementation, and certainly its survival. And as we face an uncertain future from DC, and Al would likely contest any view that any real leadership could come from DC, the more important question he would raise beyond who will lead is where will they lead us? And he would agree that now as then, we need committed minds, courageous hearts and souls to inspire us to become the voices and the architects for what the nation must become in the days and years to come. So here's to you, Al, and the genuine spirit of democracy that you left us. I miss you.
Conspiracy. Al Slocum was an unapologetic, unwavering, steadfast civil rights warrior. He opposed white supremacy, fought against it all his life. He kicked in the door of the legal academy and made sure that people of color, not only what some might describe as privileged people of color, but people of color from the underclass who were barred from this institution, he made sure we were given an opportunity. After he kicked that door open, he stood by it and made sure it stayed open because he knew, as my colleague, Robert Holmes, teaches our students, that the moment you're victorious in your struggle, the opposition is meeting to plan how they will undo the gains you've won. His work here raised an army, and now white supremacists are emboldened. They march with Nazis. They kill us in our places of worship, in our streets. The struggle is not new to people of color and fair-minded, progressive people. The ancestors lived through this and raised above even worse. And we the troops, the army he raised, must rededicate ourselves to the struggle, and like Professor Slocum, we should do it steadfastly and unapologetically with fervor and fierceness. Frederick Douglass taught us, it is not the light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. The Rutgers conspiracy lives. We're all conspirators. Slocum vive, la lucha sigue. Thank you.
I also want to say that the gift that he really gave to me personally was that because he really was such a huge presence in the law school, I was able to, in my pre-tenure years, when I was living in New York, and I still do, and I was a single mother raising my son, who's now grown, the fact that he was such a big presence in the law school, and that he spent so much time working on the issues that made this law school the way the law school that it is, and the big role that he played in fighting any battles that needed to be fought, actually made some space for me, you know, to be able to do the things I needed to do in order for me to continue to be present in this law school. And while I certainly and never have been silent on issues that have come up in the law school, but some of the time and the emotional energy that it takes to be in these struggles, for me, during especially my pre-tenure years, that was really lessened by the powerful and effective presence of Al Slocum on the faculty. And I want all of you to know, and especially for his family to know, and I have told them this individually, how grateful I really am for the way in which his presence and his advocacy here and his creation of an environment that was supportive for minority faculty, how that made, it created the space for me so that I could be in the next generation of law professors to continue the struggles that he, was so active in. Now, when
Uncle Alfred was a high hurdler and a member of the East Orange High School track team. The team had made it to the Essex County Track and Field Championships, and he would be running the relay race with 3 other hurdlers, George Moore, Ralph Garcia, and my dad, Robert Cottingham. These guys were taller than Uncle Alfred with longer strides that only required that they take the customary 7 steps in between hurdles. Because of his stature, the team practiced with Uncle Alfred taking 8 steps in between the hurdles. This meant he needed to alternate his legs and the hurdles were 42 inches high. The night before the relay race, Uncle Alfred heard my dad concede to the Scott High School rivals, who were also childhood friends, that East Orange might medal, but not win. Well, the next day, the lineup would be George Moore, Ralph Garcia, Alfred Slocum, and Robert Cottingham anchoring. After Uncle Alfred took the baton, he easily cleared the first hurdle, then the second, then the third, taking only 7 steps in between. When he passed the baton to my dad, he was neck and neck with the hurdler from Scott High, and he said, "It's on you, Cot." Uncle Alfred told it, he said, if they lost, it wouldn't be on him. East Orange High School won the championships. As you can imagine in the storytelling, there was a lot of pacing, finger pointing, and ribbing. Uncle Alfred liked that story, and so did we. Like most stories, it illustrated a point. I believe Uncle Alfred ran that relay the way he led his life. Face the challenge, make no excuses, work hard, and keep the faith.
The second is from a 95 alumni of the law school who was not in MSP. He says, "Greetings. My name is Rick Morris, and I graduated Rutgers Law in '95. I've been living in London for the last 7 years, so regrettably I can't be with you today to pay tribute to Professor Slocum, a man who has had such an impact on my development at Rutgers Law and beyond, despite us sharing so little in common politically. Professor Slocum did more to teach me to think like a lawyer than any other professor, which is incredible considering almost all of our substantive interaction occurred during only one semester when he taught me first-year property in my small section. You can really think like a lawyer. You can't really think like a lawyer without abandoning your attachment to your pre-law school mode of thinking. And Professor Slocum was a wrecking ball when it came to tearing down that old, non-structured, non-legal way of thinking and arguing. To say Professor Slocum was intense is obviously an understatement. I learned that, and Oliver, you'll relate to this. I learned early that Professor Slocum had a tradition of inviting the entire small section to his home each year for a picnic and a game of touch football. By touch football, I mean everybody but him was playing two-hand touch. The professor, on the other hand, brought the same fire and intensity evident in his classroom to the football field. I understood this immediately after being driven into the bushes by a violent open field tackle executed by a fully airborne horizontal Professor Slocum defending his home turf. One time, my roommate, who sat next to me in property, was less than 100% prepared for class. Of course, that was the day he was called on to try to present a case study. Unable to respond to Professor Slocum's rapid-fire questions, he resorted to diving into his notebook, looking to buy some time to try to dig himself out of his hole. Professor Slocum, very calmly and gently, warned him he was going to come over the desk the next time my roommate dove into his notebook in search of answers. The admonition was not heeded, and the next thing I know, Professor Slocum launches himself on top of our shared desk, his imposing figure literally towering over us and hollering, "Eyes up here! There is no salvation in those notes. There is no salvation in those notes." The next 5 minutes, my roommate had to finish the case study with Professor Slocum standing on our desk, carpet bombing questions all over his victim, literally from above. I say this with no exaggeration. After that, I was less than 120% prepared for property class exactly 0 times for the rest of the semester. But Professor Slocum didn't leave such an impact on me from his intensity alone. There was method to his madness. The intellectually violent confrontations in class, at least for me, helped accelerate my abandonment of my old ways of thinking and arguing. Gradually, over the course of the property class, we learned to separate the signal from the noise and to construct defensible arguments. You knew if you could develop arguments that would survive a few rounds with Professor Slocum and be focused and quick enough to keep him from climbing over your desk, you could debate anybody. The last thing I'd like to say about Professor Slocum is how focused he was in class in developing legal thinking. There was almost 0 distraction in his classroom. A lot of fear, to be sure, but no distraction. On a personal level, my politics could not have been more opposite of the professor's. I was one of the few members of the Federalist Society at that time, which group, unfortunately for me, had just published an op-ed piece characterizing Professor Slocum's role during his time as public advocate as lobbyist-in-chief for recreational carjackers. I was more than a little concerned about guilt by association, but I had nothing to fear. Professor Slocum was the most apolitical professor I had at Rutgers Law. Regardless of whether he felt a personal attachment to a political or policy argument being served up in class to mask the lack of legal argument, in that property class he had zero patience for the political diversions. Social justice arguments to which Professor Slocum dedicated a good portion of his life defending were deprived of any oxygen in his property class, where the purpose was a bit less ambitious than changing the world. That one property class is in my first year small section, taught by a towering Professor Slocum, was the most intense, focused, impactful class I believe that I have ever taken in any context. That class did more to teach me to think like a lawyer than any other class I took, which is even more impressive in the context of the overall high quality of the professors at Rutgers Law. In some of my more challenging moments as a lawyer and later as an investor, I have drawn on those boot camp days with Professor Slocum for inspiration to realize that I got this. It was only with the distance of a few years after that experience that I came to realize how much love and dedication Professor Slocum poured into that class to keep it so focused, intense, and effective. And for that, I will be forever grateful to him, and I may even forgive him for the bruised ribs that one day.